Philip Ittner, also on YouTube, Philipittner, and Ittner Philip on Blue Sky and on Twitter. Phil, welcome back to the program. I caught this article. Actually, it's a couple of weeks old, but it was about how Ukraine basically is desperate to purchase Patriot anti-air missiles because they're about the only thing that'll knock these Russian missiles and particularly the glide missiles out of the air. But Trump, working hand in hand with Putin, is refusing to sell them. Now, like I said, this article was a couple of weeks old. Has that changed? Our anti-aircraft? No. Okay, what's the situation
it's gotten
right
worse.
now?
It's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. And let me preface this by saying, as somebody who has lived in Kiev for the lion's share of this war, at least the full-scale invasion, I have seen Patriot missiles at work, and they have kept me safe. Nobody can say it's a lottery when Russia starts chucking munitions at you. But yes, they have these hypersonic missiles that the Patriot seems to be able to intercept. And it is an impressive show of strength, and it provides us with reassurance here in the Capitol. The worsening of the situation is that President Zelensky got to a point where, because of the monies that have been given to Ukraine by grants, whether it's even American or its own GDP or, yes, indeed, Europeans, he offered to buy $10 billion worth of Patriot munitions from the United States. That's $10 billion that Ukraine would be putting into American coffers. And for some reason, Trump, who continues to say he is so pro-business, said, nope, we don't need your $10 billion, pound sand, which is got a lot of people over here scratching their heads. I mean, it's not like, the accusation that they are looking for a grift or handouts or things like that.
I think it's fairly obvious Trump is on Putin's side here, Phil. I mean, I don't know what other conclusion any reasonable person could draw.
The man is deeply compromised, and the sooner we wake up and recognize it, the better. And I have contacts within the intelligence community because of all my time that I spent covering the various wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. I know American public affairs officers who then, when they rotated out and the wars ended, they joined a whole plethora of different groups, whether it was intelligence or defense or security, or even some of the strategic, parts of the economy. And a lot of them have said to me, off the record and kind of on background, we're deeply concerned about the infiltration of the Russians into our body politic. We're worried about the likes of Tulsi Gabbard. We're worried about Kash Patel. We're worried about our colleagues. Who is compromised in the down the hallway? My fellow investigator at the FBI, or my whatever it is. And I'm speaking hypothetically, but there is a large spread concern amongst the intelligence community in the United States that they are not speaking about too publicly. It happens, but it doesn't happen too often, in that the Russians are they're inside the wire, as they used to say. We've been infiltrated, and the commander-in-chief may be one of the people who's compromised. This just should be a concern for everybody.
Did you ever read John Stormer's book, None Dare Call It Treason, back in the 60s?
No, but I've heard of it. I'm familiar with it.
I strongly recommend it. I read it when I was 13 years old. My dad gave it to me. We got it at a John Birch Society meeting. And, it's basically about, he documents in a fairly flimsy fashion. I mean, it was McCarthy-esque, but basically what he purports to do is document how the State Department was filled with communists and agents of the Soviet Union. But the reason I bring that up is because that book galvanized a generation of conservatives. I mean, the John Birch Society bought millions of copies of that book and gave them away. It was ubiquitous. It was everywhere in the 60s.
Yeah.
And I'm just astonished that, we could have had the entire nation so hysterical about communism. I mean, that book was largely used to justify the Vietnam War. That we've got to take a stand against these commies. And yet today, what that book described appears to be being played out. I mean, speaking of the State Department, Marco Rubio just shut down an office within the State Department called the Countering Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Hub. There are 40 employees he put on paid leave, and he fired 80 contractors who work with this group. And what do? They identify Russian disinformation so it can be debunked. And at a time when Russian disinformation campaigns against the United States, which started in a big way in 2016 with that election, have just peaked out. I mean, we even found podcasters taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from Russia to toe their line. Yeah, millions of dollars to toe their line. So it's just breathtaking to me, Phil, how successful this Russian campaign has been in the United States. And I think,
they've reduced it to a meme. I mean, how better to disregard the very real threat that exists from Moscow than to turn it into Russia meme.
Yeah.
This whole very dismissive, where you can just outright say, oh, if you think that the Russians are inside our body politic, you're wearing a tinfoil hat. Right. I've studied the Russians for nearly 30 years now. We are under attack. I've said it many times before. I'll say it again. I don't know. The techniques that they use are varied. They are always deniable. They are always in the shadows and in the smoke and the mirrors of Russian intelligence. They're very good at what they do, and they know us extremely well. They study the Americans more than anybody else, with the possible exception of the Brits. And they know our pressure points, and they know how to get compromised people, or they know how to foster what referred to as fellow travelers, people who take in Russian propaganda and accept it as gospel, and it's intentional.
Yeah, and I would argue they've had a couple major policy victories. The first being making Trump president twice. The second being Brexit. And of course,
look at what just happened. And we haven't spoken since Sunday, Tom, but I think it's important for us to address what happened on Palm Sunday. This was a particularly atrocious attack that the Russians conducted on a town called Sumy, where people had gathered to mark the religious holiday of Palm Sunday, but also to commemorate those lives that have been lost. And the Russians attacked in a particularly insidious way, which we used to call in Baghdad, when I was deputy bureau chief there, a double tap. So you would hit something. And if you were intended to do harm, the idea is hit something, and then when all the just like Mr. Rogers used to say, look for the helpers. The helpers would come in to try and assist in the initial attack, and cynically, you would follow up then with a second attack, which would harm the ambulance services, the fire services, the civil engineers, the people who are out there trying to
And
help.
Apparently that second attack was cluster munitions, which are, prohibited.
Yes, which is illegal.
Yeah.
In urban areas, it's illegal. Now, the Ukrainians have cluster munitions as well, but we have no reports of them using it in an urban setting, only on the battlefield. So, Sumy was an egregious crime. And what does President Trump say? He says it's a mistake. It was a mistake, giving the benefit to the Russians, who have a long history of war crimes here. An ambulance was hit just yesterday in Kherson, targeted by a drone. This is happening daily. War crimes are happening daily. And the President of the United States is making excuses for the Russians. And
not only that, when
something's rotten in the state of Denmark.
Yeah, and then a reporter asked Trump, Zelensky is offering you $10 billion that he got from England and France. He's offering you this money to buy American Patriot missile systems manufactured in the United States of America, and you're turning him down. Why? And Trump says, and I quote, this is just from 2 days ago at the Oval Office, quote, or actually it was from about a few weeks ago. He says, quote, he's always looking to purchase missiles. Listen, when you start a war, you got to know you can win a war. You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size and then hope that people will give you some missiles.
That's in the Oval.
Yeah.
That's the President of the United States in the Oval Office.
Lying to the press.
I don't know if he was physically behind the Resolute desk, but regurgitating word for word Kremlin talking points. We have a serious problem here. We really do.
We seriously do. Phil, I have a minute and a half here before we hit a hard break. And
Sure.
so what's the situation there now? You mentioned what happened in Sumy. The world saw that and was horrified. But what else is going on in Ukraine? What do we need to know?
Well, we're hoping to get a new. The Europeans seem to be stepping up. There's talk that the Germans may start providing a cruise missile that has been long desired by Ukraine. The battlefield itself remains mostly static, very incremental changes, but certainly it does look as though Russia is involved in a renewed offensive action. They seem to be focused on the north and middle east of the country. They don't seem to be going south through Kherson, which would mean that they were trying to target Odessa, and that would change the dynamic of the war because Odessa is critical for both sides. We've been relatively safe here in the capital. Trying to think of there's so much going on, but obviously, Europe and Ukrainians are looking at the United States and more realizing that Washington can't be relied upon, and so they're starting to step up things in Europe, the manufacturing, and even here domestically, the warfighting capacity keeps going up and up. So they may be able to continue with this war without American aid. But then what does that mean for the alliance?
Yeah, exactly. They're going to have to. I think NATO is dead, frankly. I think Article 5 certainly is dead. Yeah. Phil Ittner, the great Phil Ittner. Check out his podcast, On the Edge. Phil, thanks again for dropping by every week. I really appreciate the updates.